show a fake cop, slam my cousin at ranch gate, then froze. When Dad walked out in full sheriff uniform. Entitled people. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. The ranch sat on the outskirts of town, nestled in a wide expanse of land where the horizon stretched endlessly. The air was crisp, filled with the earthy scent of grass and the distant hum of nature. It was the kind of place that felt timeless, where every corner of the property told a story of generations past. A worn-out wooden fence lined the perimeter, and the barn in the distance seemed almost like an old friend to anyone who had spent their childhood running through its fields. Inside the ranch house, the atmosphere was warm, filled with the comforting sounds of family members talking, laughter, and the occasional clink of dishes being prepared for a big meal. This wasn't just a place to stay. It was home, and it had always been a symbol of unity for the family. Every year, relatives gathered here for celebrations, with everyone pitching in to cook, catch up, and enjoy the open space. Among the family members was Marcus, the protagonist's cousin. He wasn't much younger than the protagonist, but he was the type who had always been a bit more adventurous. He'd spent the last few years working in the city, taking on odd jobs and living a fast-paced life that felt a world away from the simplicity of ranch life. This weekend was a rare chance for him to unwind, to escape from the pressures of his usual routine, and reconnect with his roots. The moment Marcus arrived, he was greeted with hearty hugs from his aunt and uncle, who ran the ranch. His cousin, the protagonist, grinned widely, teasing him about how much he'd changed since the last family gathering. The familiar banter set the tone for the weekend, and Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over him. It was exactly what he needed. Time to relax, share stories, and enjoy the closeness of a family that always seemed to have his back. As the sun began to set, casting an amber glow across the land, Marcus wandered out to the front gate, taking in the view. He was lost in thought, thinking about how different life had been since he left, when suddenly a car pulled up. It wasn't unusual to see visitors around here, but something about this particular car caught his attention. The quiet hum of the ranch was suddenly interrupted by a knock at the gate. Marcus, still standing near the fence, turned toward the sound, his brow furrowing slightly. It was a crisp morning, and the only people who usually visited were neighbors or friends of the family. But this man didn't look familiar at all. He stood outside the gate in plain clothes, a dark jacket and slacks that seemed out of place for the wide open space of the ranch. The man was holding something in his hand, but Marcus couldn't make it out from where he stood. His first instinct was to wave it off. Maybe it was just a lost traveler or someone looking for directions, but something about the man's presence felt different. There was an air of authority in the way he stood, but it was subtle, almost too subtle. The man cleared his throat and Marcus took a hesitant step forward, meeting him halfway toward the gate. The visitor didn't waste any time, launching right into his introduction. "Good morning, I'm with the Homeowners Association," he said, his voice steady, almost rehearsed. "I'm here to address a few issues with your property." Marcus blinked, confused. Homeowners Association? It didn't make sense. The ranch had been in the family for decades. No HOA had ever contacted them about any property issues. The man's claim felt off, like a piece of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. He shifted his weight uneasily, not sure how to respond. "I'm sorry, I didn't know we had an HOA around here," Marcus said, his voice calm but edged with uncertainty. The man's smile was polite, but there was something in his eyes that made Marcus uncomfortable. He went on to talk about regulations and rules that didn't ring any bells for Marcus. Mentions of things like compliance and inspection were thrown around, but the cousin couldn't shake the feeling that he was being played somehow. Still, he didn't want to come off as rude, so he listened, his mind racing with questions. The man continued, flipping through some papers he had, but Marcus couldn't focus on the words anymore. His thoughts drifted. Why was this guy here, and why now? The last thing Marcus wanted was to escalate something that could easily be a misunderstanding. So he kept nodding, pretending to follow along while his unease grew by the second. "Can I see some identification?" Marcus asked, trying to stay polite but firm, hoping for something that would reassure him. The man paused for a fraction of a second, and that tiny hesitation didn't go unnoticed. But then He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a card that looked a little too pristine to be real. Marcus squinted at it, but didn't press further. The feeling in his gut was telling him something wasn't right. The man's tone shifted as he continued, no longer as polite and measured. His words began to take on a sharper edge, and the fabricated paperwork he had been holding out now seemed to be at the center of his new approach. He flipped through the papers, muttering under his breath as if he were looking for something specific. "You've been violating several HOA regulations," he said, his voice now carrying a tone of authority. "There's a clear issue with your property boundaries, and I've already noted some unapproved structures." Marcus's stomach twisted. His family had been on this land for years, and every inch of it was well known to them. There was no question of boundaries or unapproved additions. It didn't make sense. "I don't know where you're getting this from," Marcus said, trying to remain calm. "There's been no talk about boundaries or structures being off limits. This land's been in my family for generations." The man's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer to the gate, leaning slightly in toward Marcus. His demeanor grew more intense with each passing second. "Well, clearly, you're not up to date on the rules. I've got all the evidence right here," he said, waving the papers as if they held undeniable truth. Marcus glanced at the papers, but all he saw were vague lists and scribbled notes. Nothing concrete. "These don't make sense. You're saying things that aren't true." The man's expression hardened. "I don't need to explain myself to you. You'll have to pay a fine for these violations, and if you don't comply, further actions will be taken. I'll report you." Marcus's jaw clenched. Something about this entire situation didn't sit right, but the more he tried to speak, the more the man escalated. "Listen, I'm telling you, there's been a mistake." Marcus tried again, but his voice was now shaking with frustration. "I don't care what you think, kid," the man snapped, cutting him off mid-sentence. "The facts are the facts, and you're in violation." His tone was becoming more hostile, more like an accusation than a conversation. Marcus's heart raced as he took a step back, the tension building in the air. He was trying to figure out how to get this man to leave, but the more he explained, the angrier the man seemed to get. "You're not listening. You've got the wrong information," Marcus said, his voice rising, though he was doing his best to stay calm. The man's jaw tightened, and with a final, exasperated gesture, he shoved the papers at Marcus, almost forcing them into his hands. "You'll regret this. If you don't fix it, you'll be in real trouble," he spat. His eyes were cold now, and his posture was aggressive, as though he was daring Marcus to push back further. Marcus's mind was racing. There was no way this man was really with the HOA. No legitimate official would behave this way. His instincts screamed that something was off, but the more he tried to reason, the angrier the man became. The conversation was no longer about resolving a misunderstanding. It felt like a confrontation now, and Marcus knew it was only going to escalate if he didn't find a way to put an end to it. As the man's words grew louder and more accusatory, Marcus's frustration hit a boiling point. He had tried to stay composed, but the relentless hostility from the so-called HOA officer was too much. His heart raced, a knot tightening in his stomach as he exchanged tense words with the man who was now practically yelling at him. In the midst of the argument, a door creaked open behind Marcus. It was faint at first, but it was enough to cut through the rising tension. He turned just as a tall figure emerged from the house. The man in the sheriff's uniform was unmistakable. It was his father. The moment he stepped outside, the entire dynamic of the situation shifted. His father, the county sheriff, stood tall in full uniform, black boots, badge gleaming in the sunlight, and a broad-shouldered frame that exuded authority. His uniform, well-pressed and perfectly fitted, seemed to transform the space around him. It wasn't just the uniform itself, but the weight of his presence that immediately changed the atmosphere. The man by the gate froze mid-sentence, his body stiffening as if he had been struck by an invisible force. Marcus could see it clearly. The man's bravado, the sharpness in his posture, all began to falter. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. The shift was instant, like a cloud had moved over the sun, casting a shadow over the entire interaction. The sheriff's eyes scanned the situation in an instant, taking in the exchange between Marcus and the stranger at the gate. His gaze was steady, unflinching, and sharp, something that only years of experience in law enforcement could hone. Without saying a word, he took a few measured steps toward the gate, his boots making a soft but firm sound against the gravel. The man who had been so aggressive just moments before now looked small, unsure, and visibly rattled. He took a step back, his posture suddenly less confident, his eyes darting nervously. The shift in power was palpable, like the entire scene had flipped in an instant. Marcus stood silently for a moment, watching as his father moved closer. The tension in the air was thick, but there was something reassuring about his father's presence, something that immediately felt like the promise of order and calm. His father had dealt with countless situations like this in his career, and to Marcus it was as if the world had suddenly tilted back into place. The man in plain clothes stood there, his eyes wide, his lips twitching as he finally registered the sheriff's presence. His posture, once so confident and forceful, now seemed to collapse inward. His breath hitched, and for a brief moment, it was as if time itself slowed down. The sheriff didn't say a word. He simply stood there, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the imposter with an unyielding gaze that seemed to pierce through every ounce of bravado the man had been clinging to. The air grew heavy with silence, and the man's composure started to crack. He opened his mouth, clearly trying to gather himself, but the words stumbled out in a disjointed mess. Look, I'm with the HOA, he stammered, his voice shaking slightly now. His fingers fumbled with the papers he'd been holding, almost as if they had become too heavy for him to handle. The sheriff took another step forward, his boots scraping the gravel with a slow, deliberate sound that only seemed to heighten the tension. The imposter took an awkward half-step back, as though instinctively trying to put distance between himself and the man who had just walked out of the house. I've got the authority, the man continued, his voice cracking now, as if trying to convince himself more than anyone else. I was just, conducting a routine inspection. Nothing personal. Just some paperwork I need to complete. The sheriff's unblinking gaze never wavered. You're not affiliated with any HOA, he said calmly, his voice low but sharp. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, one that cut through the man's flimsy excuse like a knife. The imposter's eyes darted around nervously. Sweat had begun to beat on his forehead, despite the cool morning air. He cleared his throat, trying to muster some semblance of authority, but it was too late. His facade was slipping. The confidence that had once fueled his aggression was now replaced with panic. I am just doing my job here. You can check with the HOA. They'll back me up, he muttered, his words tumbling out in a desperate scramble. The sheriff's lips tightened, and there was a subtle shift in his stance. The man's story was unraveling with every word he spoke. His stammering, his desperate need to justify his presence, it all pointed to one thing. He had no real authority here. He wasn't from any HOA. He wasn't anything he had claimed to be. The imposter's eyes flicked toward the gate, as if considering making a break for it. But with the sheriff standing there, imposing and unyielding, any thought of escape quickly faded. The game was up. The sheriff took a step closer to the gate, his eyes never leaving the man's face. The air felt thick with tension, the only sound the distant rustling of the wind through the trees. The imposter shifted uncomfortably, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched the papers. But he couldn't hide the nervous flicker in his eyes. You said you're with the HOA, the sheriff said, his voice calm, yet there was an edge to it that made the man's defenses crumble even further. Can you tell me which association you're with, specifically? The man opened his mouth but hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the question. Well, it's the, Hillview HOA. Over by the sheriff didn't let him finish. Hillview? There's no such thing around here, he interrupted, his voice steady, his tone unfazed. The imposter faltered, his face flushing. He quickly tried to recover, pulling another sheet of paper from his folder and thrusting it toward the sheriff. Look, this is my documentation. This is all I need. I'm just following the process. The sheriff took the papers from him slowly, his eyes scanning the contents. He barely glanced at them before looking back up at the man. This paperwork doesn't match up with anything I've seen in over 20 years of law enforcement. There's no official seal, no real contact information, And that Hillview HOA you mentioned? Not a single person in this area has heard of it. The man's face turned an even deeper shade of red, and he began to stammer, clearly panicking. I don't know what you're talking about. I've been doing this for months. I've got my orders. You can call my supervisor. I'm just following the rules. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. He wasn't buying it. You're not with any HOA, he said, his voice low and firm. The realization was dawning on Marcus too. This wasn't just some mistake or misunderstanding. The man was lying, and lying badly. The man's breathing became shallow, and he took a step back, trying to regain some control. But the sheriff was relentless. "Who are you really?" he asked, his gaze locking onto the imposter with a quiet intensity that made the man shrink further. The man's lips trembled as he opened his mouth, but no words came out at first. He was caught. The truth was right there, ready to be exposed. I've done this before," he muttered, his voice barely audible now. "I just needed the money. People fall for it. They think I'm legit. I've done this in other places." The sheriff's expression remained unchanged, but Marcus could feel the weight of the moment. The man wasn't just some confused visitor. He had a history, a pattern of impersonating authority to get what he wanted, using fabricated stories and fake documents to intimidate people into compliance. "You're a fraud," the sheriff said, his voice cold now, "and you're going to have a lot of explaining to do when the real authorities arrive." The imposter's shoulders slumped, the last of his bravado slipping away. He looked like a man who had just realized his game was over and the walls were closing in on him. The sheriff took out his phone, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency as he dialed the number for local law enforcement. His gaze never left the imposter, whose face had turned an unhealthy shade of pale. The man's attempts to backpedal were futile now. The sheriff's calm demeanor had shattered his remaining confidence. "Yeah, this is Sheriff Collins," the sheriff said into the phone, his voice steady and authoritative. "I've got an individual here who's been impersonating HOA officers, using fraudulent documents to intimidate property owners. I need a unit to respond. We'll be waiting at the gate." As the sheriff hung up, the man's posture sagged. He stood still, his eyes darting nervously around, but there was nowhere to run. The reality was sinking in fast. He wasn't getting out of this. In the distance, a few of the ranch's neighbors, having caught wind of what was happening, began to trickle toward the scene. At first, it was just a few curious faces, but as the sheriff continued to stand firm with the imposter, more and more people arrived, whispering to each other and exchanging glances. The quiet neighborhood was now a small gathering of concerned and relieved residents. Some of them were familiar faces to Marcus, people he had seen around town or on previous visits. His aunt and uncle, who had been inside the house, joined the growing crowd as well. It didn't take long for word to spread, and the murmurs of recognition began. "I knew something was off with him," one neighbor said, shaking his head as he approached. "He came around here last month too, talked a big game about HOA rules, and I almost believed him. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right." Another neighbor nodded. "Same here. He showed up at my place a few weeks ago, said I was in violation for something ridiculous. I almost paid the fine until I realized I hadn't received a single notice from the real HOA. Just felt wrong." The sheriff, standing with his arms crossed, listened attentively to the accounts, his presence lending a sense of authority to the conversation. As more neighbors shared their experiences, it became clear that the imposter had been making the rounds, using the same tactics: fabricated violations, fake paperwork, and a confident, authoritative front to trick people into paying fines they didn't owe. Marcus stood off to the side, taking it all in. The neighbors were shocked but grateful that someone had finally caught the man. He could see the relief in their faces, the anxiety that had built up over the past few weeks suddenly beginning to dissipate. "I'm glad you're here, Sheriff," one of the neighbors said with a sigh. "I was starting to think we were going to have to deal with this on our own." The sheriff nodded once, his expression grim but resolute. "You shouldn't have had to. That's why we have law enforcement." He turned back to the imposter, who was now fidgeting with his hands, avoiding eye contact. It wasn't long before a local patrol car pulled up, the flashing lights cutting through the quiet morning like a signal that the situation was now officially in the hands of the law. The officers quickly moved to apprehend the imposter, who offered no resistance. His shoulders slumped in defeat. The sheriff exchanged a brief word with the officers, ensuring they had all the necessary details before stepping aside to let them take over. As the man was handcuffed and led to the patrol car, the neighbors began to disperse, their voices low but filled with a mix of relief and frustration. Some expressed anger that this had happened in the first place, while others simply voiced gratitude that the situation was finally under control. Marcus watched as the patrol car pulled away, the scene now quiet once again. The whole ordeal had unfolded so quickly, yet it felt like a weight had been lifted from the community. The sheriff turned to Marcus, offering a reassuring smile as he walked back toward the ranch house. "Don't worry, son," he said. "He won't be causing trouble around here anymore." As the sheriff's car disappeared down the road, the mood in the air shifted from tension to a quiet sense of relief. The neighbors who had gathered at the ranch gate remained, their voices low but animated, sharing what they had experienced and talking amongst themselves. The sense of camaraderie was palpable, as though the entire community had just weathered a storm together. "I can't believe he was out here pretending to be someone with authority," one neighbor said, shaking his head in disbelief. "I'm just glad someone caught on before he could do any real damage." Another neighbor, an older woman with graying hair, spoke up, her voice tinged with concern. "I thought something was off when he showed up at my door last week, but he was so convincing, I almost gave him the benefit of the doubt." She paused, eyes wide with realization. "He got so many of us, didn't he?" Several others nodded, murmuring their agreement. It was clear that the man had been preying on the community for some time, using the same manipulative tactics and preying on the residents' trust. But now that the truth had been revealed, they were coming together stronger for it. "I'm just glad Marcus's dad showed up when he did," one of the men said, clapping Marcus on the shoulder. "That could have turned ugly if it went on much longer." "I agree," another neighbor chimed in, his voice steady but filled with relief. "I've lived around here my whole life, and something like this has never happened. We need to make sure it doesn't happen again." The conversation shifted as more people began to share their thoughts about what could be done to prevent similar incidents in the future. Ideas flowed freely, with neighbors suggesting everything from installing security cameras around the neighborhood to setting up a more formal system of communication between residents. "We've got a neighborhood email list," one neighbor pointed out. "Maybe we can use it to send out updates on anything unusual. That way everyone stays in the loop." "That's a good idea," the sheriff said, having returned to join the conversation. "Communication is key, and it'll help everyone stay alert without feeling paranoid." Another resident, a young woman who lived a few houses down, offered her input. "What if we held a community meeting? We could talk about what happened, share our stories, and come up with other ways to protect ourselves." The suggestion was met with nods of approval. It was clear that everyone was eager to work together and ensure that this kind of situation didn't catch them off guard again. There was strength in their unity, and it was starting to show. Marcus, still processing the events of the morning, stood off to the side with his family. He felt a sense of gratitude for the support they were receiving. It was one thing to know your neighbors, but it was something entirely different to have them rally around you when you needed it most. They were no longer just people who lived nearby. They were partners in making sure this community stayed safe. As the conversations continued, the mood lightened, with laughter and easy chatter replacing the tense atmosphere of earlier. The imposter's brief reign of fear had already begun to feel like a distant memory, replaced by a renewed sense of solidarity among the people who called this quiet corner of the world home. "We'll be fine," Marcus's father said as he looked over the group, his expression proud. "This community's got each other's backs, and that's something no one can take away from us." It was a simple sentiment, but as Marcus glanced around at the faces of his neighbors, he felt the truth of it sink in deep. Together they would move forward, stronger, wiser, and more connected than ever before. In the weeks following the incident, the imposter's fate was sealed as legal proceedings unfolded. The sheriff, having gathered evidence and taken statements from the community, prepared to testify in court. His role as a law enforcement officer was clear, but now his presence as a key witness carried weight. The investigation was thorough, and the legal system began to take its course. The courtroom, though small, was filled with a quiet sense of anticipation. The imposter, now identified and facing multiple charges, sat in the defendant's chair, his expression blank, but his discomfort was palpable. His facade of authority had crumbled, and now he was just another defendant facing justice. The sheriff took the stand first, recounting the events at the ranch with clarity and precision. He described how he had arrived at the scene, the behavior of the imposter, and the subsequent revelation that the man had been impersonating an HOA official. He spoke about the false documents, the inconsistencies in the man's story, and the evidence that had ultimately led to his detainment. His testimony was solid and unwavering, backed by the facts of the case. As the sheriff spoke, Marcus and his family sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, observing the process. It was surreal to see the events of that day play out in front of them. The man who had threatened and harassed them now sitting in a position where he had no power. There was something reassuring in the way the justice system moved forward, even when it seemed like the world outside was full of chaos and deception. The community, too, had a role in the proceedings. Several neighbors took the stand, recounting their own experiences with the imposter, how he had approached them, the false accusations he had made, and the sense of violation they had all felt. One by one, their testimonies reinforced the sheriff's account, each voice adding weight to the case against the man. The imposter, whose bravado had long since dissipated, sat quietly as the evidence piled up against him. There were no more excuses, no more attempts to justify his actions. His defense, flimsy at best, faltered under the pressure of the truth. The prosecution pressed forward, and it became clear that the man would not be walking away without facing the consequences of his actions. The verdict came swiftly, and when it was announced, there was a collective sense of relief that washed over the room. The man was found guilty on all charges: impersonation of an officer, fraud, and attempted extortion. He was sentenced to a substantial fine and prison time, a harsh but necessary reminder that no one was above the law. As the gavel came down, Marcus's father, the sheriff, stood tall, his face a mix of pride and resolve. He had done his job, and the community had rallied behind him. The sense of justice was not just in the courtroom, but in the hearts of the residents who had supported each other through the ordeal. For the neighbors who had gathered to witness the proceedings, there was an overwhelming feeling that justice had been served. The sense of unity that had grown in the aftermath of the incident now felt solidified. It was a reminder to everyone that while they may have been caught off guard, they weren't helpless. The community had worked together to ensure that no one would take advantage of them again. In the days that followed, the neighborhood returned to a quiet normalcy, but the lessons from the ordeal lingered. People began to pay closer attention to their surroundings, communicate more openly with each other, and share information more freely. There was a heightened sense of vigilance, but it was tempered with a new sense of trust in one another. The events had tested the community, but they had emerged stronger, more connected, and more aware of the power they held when they stood together. The imposter had been caught, and justice had been served. But the real victory was the unity that had been forged in the fire of this shared experience. As the dust settled and life on the ranch began to return to its usual rhythm, the weight of everything that had transpired began to sink in. What had started as a simple family gathering had turned into a vivid reminder of the strength of community, the importance of vigilance, and the undeniable power of justice. Marcus, standing on the porch, looked out at the rolling fields, taking in the quiet of the place. The ranch, which had always felt like a peaceful sanctuary, now felt even more significant. It had been the backdrop for something that none of them could have predicted, but it was also a place where the family had come together and stood strong, supported by neighbors who had rallied to their side. The events had unfolded quickly, and in some ways, it felt surreal. The imposter, once so confident in his false authority, had been exposed for what he truly was. The sheriff had done his part to uphold the law, but it had been the community that had truly made a difference. They had shared their experiences, spoken up when it mattered, and in doing so, they had protected one another. The importance of community awareness had never felt more clear. What could have been a quiet and overlooked crime had turned into a collective movement to ensure that no one would be taken advantage of again. People were talking more openly now, checking in on each other in ways they hadn't before. Neighborhood emails, group messages, and simple conversations had become vital tools in staying connected and aware of what was happening around them. For Marcus and his family, it was a reminder that trust in law enforcement wasn't just about the badge or the uniform. It was about the connection between officers and the people they served. His father, the sheriff, had been there when it mattered most, and his presence had instilled a sense of security and calm. But it was the relationship between the residents and law enforcement that truly made the difference. The community didn't just rely on the sheriff to protect them. They worked together, each person playing a role in keeping their neighborhood safe. As the family sat down for dinner that evening, the atmosphere had shifted. The tension of the earlier events had faded, replaced by a sense of closeness and unity. The laughter around the table was louder than it had been in days, with stories being exchanged and memories being made. It was as if the ordeal had brought them all even closer, reminding them of what truly mattered: family, trust, and the strength found in working together. In the weeks that followed, the sense of unity only grew stronger. The neighbors continued to stay in touch, planning community gatherings and discussing ways to keep their neighborhoods safe. There was an underlying sense of gratitude in the air, a shared understanding that while life could be unpredictable, they were no longer alone in facing it. For Marcus, this experience had changed something deep within him. It wasn't just about the events that had unfolded. It was about how they had all come together to handle it. The trust in his father, the sheriff, was stronger than ever. But there was something else, something more powerful, a renewed sense of connection to the community. They had faced something as a unit, and together they had prevailed. The family continued their gathering, each person more vigilant and aware of their surroundings. But there was no longer any fear in the air, only a quiet confidence that came from knowing they had each other's backs. The ranch, once a place of simple relaxation, had become a symbol of resilience and unity. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the land, Marcus couldn't help but feel proud. Proud of his family, his neighbors, and the strength that had come from standing together.